965 kilometers of canals and causeways sit under the Amazon canopy, mapped by LiDAR, all part of one regional culture. That number is the first exhibit. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what it measures and why the institution that generated it made sure it never became a question. Here is what the record shows happened to the Amazon basin. For nearly 4 centuries, the written testimony of the men who actually traveled it was treated as fiction. A dense, engineered, populated landscape was described by eyewitnesses in 1542, then erased from the scientific record by a theory that never tested the claim. It simply declared the environment incapable of supporting it. This is not speculation. Every piece of evidence I am going to show you exists in accessible archives. Every gap I am going to show you is documented in the same records that were supposed to fill it. The question is not whether this happened. The record is clear enough about that. The question is how an institution processes something out of existence without anyone deciding to process it out of existence. That is what the exhibits answer. Here is what the institution says happened. In 1971, Smithsonian archaeologist Betty J. Meggers published Amazonia, Man and Culture, in a Counterfeit Paradise. Her argument was not lazy. She looked at the region's acidic, weathered oxasols, at the limited protein available in a tropical floodplain, and concluded that no soil this poor could sustain permanent agriculture or a dense population. Here is why that explanation is not unreasonable. Serious people accepted it for decades because, on paper, the chemistry checked out. The alibi holds for almost everything. Almost. In 2009, soil biogeochemist Johannes Lehmann's research at Cornell found that Terra Preta, the dark earth scattered across the basin, carries 50 to 100% more organic matter than the surrounding forest soil, and holds it for thousands of years after the people who made it left. The theory cannot account for soil that should not exist. A good alibi accounts for the evidence. This one accounts for most of it. The piece it cannot account for is the piece we are going to follow. Here is the first document that does not fit. The Causeways research, published by Prümers team in Nature in 2022. LiDAR sweeps of the Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia. This is what it shows. Civic ceremonial centers of 147 and 315 hectares, 22-meter pyramids, concentric earthen rings, reservoirs built to hold water on purpose. If the official explanation is correct, this terrain should show scattered, mobile settlement, small bands moving before the soil gives out. It shows a 4-tiered urban network instead. The standard account handles isolated ruins by calling them exceptions, a local anomaly in an otherwise empty landscape. That explanation accounts for one mound. It does not account for a hierarchy of settlements spanning hundreds of hectares, planned in tiers, sustained for 9 centuries. 2 documents, 2 institutions, the same gap in the same place. Here is the second. Carolina Levis and her team, publishing in Science in 2017, sampled tree composition across the entire Amazon basin. Of roughly 16,000 tree species, 227 make up half of every individual tree in the forest. Of those, the ones domesticated by pre-Columbian people, Brazil nut, cacao, acai, are about 5 times more likely to dominate near archaeological sites than chance would predict. If the forest were untouched wilderness, species dominance should track soil and rainfall, not human settlement. It shows the opposite. It shows a forest that remembers who planted it. The standard account explains scattered domesticated trees as birds and rivers doing the work nature always does. That explains random dispersal. It does not explain a 5-fold concentration next to human sites, basin-wide, in a pattern too consistent for chance. Why does the botanical record concentrate exactly where the archaeological record does? Which office in 1971 reviewed the soil chemistry data before ruling out permanent settlement? Where is the disposition record showing that hyperdominance was ever checked against Meggers's ceiling? Every theory that claims to have measured a limit should have a measurement. This one does not. The most obvious explanation for all of this is that these are isolated pockets, a Causeways city here, a Terra Preta patch there, exceptions inside a genuinely difficult environment. That explanation is serious. It has been made by serious people. We looked at it carefully. It cannot account for the geometry. Heckenberger's 2008 survey of the Upper Xingu, published in Science, found road networks oriented to the solstices, connecting grid-planned towns hundreds of kilometers from the Bolivian sites. Two separate regions, the same deliberate planning. It does not explain why the domesticated tree effect holds basin-wide, not just near one excavated city. Levis's 2017 data spans the entire Amazon, not a single dig site. And it has no answer for the scale of the canal network itself. 965 kilometers of engineered waterway, documented by Prümers' team, is not the footprint of an exception. It is the footprint of a system. Isolated pockets is not the answer. Not because it is implausible, because the record does not support it at the 3 points where it needs to most. When you rule out isolated pockets, what is left is not a theory. It is a description of what the record shows. The 24th of June, 1542. Gaspar de Carvajal, a Dominican friar traveling with Francisco de Orellana's expedition, was struck by an arrow that passed through his eye during a battle along the river. He was not a soldier. He was the expedition's chronicler, doing his job writing down what he saw so the Spanish crown would have a record. This is not a villain. This is what the inside of the system looks like when a specific person is standing in it. His journal described riverbank settlements and highways running into the interior. For 4 centuries, that account sat in the archive unconfirmed, while the road networks Heckenberger later mapped in the Upper Xingu ran on the same northeast to southwest orientation. Carvajal had no instrument to measure and no reason to invent. Carvajal was not deciding anything. He was recording. The difference between those two things is the entire case. You already know how this works, not because you studied it, because you have been inside institutions. You know what happens to the thing that does not fit the form. Nobody decided that Carvajal's account should disappear. Nobody decided that Amazonian soil should be assumed infertile forever. The system had no instrument for measuring an engineered forest, so it built a ceiling instead and called the ceiling a fact. It generated friction in a framework built for tidy conclusions, so it was not destroyed. It was processed. And processing at sufficient scale and sufficient indifference produces the same result as destruction. This is not how conspiracies work. This is how filing systems work. The antagonist is not a person with a motive. The antagonist is a category that did not exist. The last exhibit, the Sitio Archaeologico Jaco Sa, a geoglyph near Rio Branco. Acre, a perfect circle inside a square, cut by ancient earth movers using wood and stone. It sat unclassified for decades, before Brazil's own heritage institute, IPHAN, listed it in 2018. It waited in plain sight, because no category existed to receive it. The institution that dismissed Carvajal still exists in some form. It updated its methods. It runs LiDAR now, instead of dismissing journals. The category Engineered Tropical Wilderness still has no clean designation in the older textbooks. If a 16th century chronicle arrived today describing a 5-league settlement chain, the form would look different. The outcome years of default skepticism before verification would not. The Amazon's erasure from the scientific record did not need an enemy. It needed a form with no field for what it was. Here is what the case establishes. The Amazon basin's engineered landscape did not go unrecognized through negligence alone. The pattern of the gap soil chemistry never tested against the ceiling it justified. Botanical hyperdominance never cross-checked against settlement maps. Road geometry in 2 separate regions, dismissed independently rather than compared, is too specific for simple oversight. What the record shows is a discipline processing an anomaly, the way disciplines process everything that doesn't fit, efficiently, indifferently, and without leaving a record of the processing itself. What this case cannot tell you is whether anyone, at any point between 1542 and 2017, looked at Carvajal's journal next to a soil sample and recognized the connection and set it aside anyway. That knowledge, if it existed, was itself processed. It did not survive in any form the record can reach. The case is complete except for that. You can decide whether that gap matters. I have been looking at it long enough to know I cannot decide for you. What I can tell you is this. The Jaco Sa geoglyph is still there, 50 kilometers from Rio Branco. It is accessible, it exists, and it is the only piece of this case that was never inside the theory that tried to explain it away. That is either a coincidence or it is the most important fact in the file. The record cannot tell you which. Neither can I.